welcome to PsychSessions re-release. This is a curated series of episodes that we have recorded over the years that may have been lost in the library. So enjoy listening to some of the best from PsychSessions.
Welcome to PsychSessions on Teaching and Learning Centers. My name is Chris Hackala, and I'm your podcast host. In this series of conversations, we speak with folks who have made the leap from a traditional faculty member position to a role in a center for teaching and learning. The conversations focus on how individuals moved from faculty to a center and how that move impacted their work, their career trajectory, and their personal and professional identity. Along the way, we talk about tips, advice, and challenges that come from working in a center. Sit back and enjoy these chats on PsychSessions on Teaching and Learning Centers. I'm here today with Victor Benassi, Professor Emeritus and Emeritus Director for the Center for Excellence and Innovation in Teaching and Learning at the University of New Hampshire. I probably got that wrong. I'd like to say welcome, Victor. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks, Chris. Happy to be here.
I would like to start this by saying this is a bit of an anomaly and an odd situation for me as I sit here in a room that was my office when I was a graduate student, talking to Victor, who was my professor when I was in graduate school, teaching the course that we'll talk about in a little while, that I fretted about while sitting in this very same spot. So it'll be an interesting conversation. So, Victor, I really appreciate you taking the time, and I do want to start with some sort of structural issues of how we're going to go through this, and that is we're going to talk a little bit about your background. We're going to talk a little bit about your identity and what's happened to your identity over the course of your career, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some advice. So I'd like to start with just a little bit about you and your background, and if you could just talk a little bit about how you got into this world, where you started, your graduate training, just sort of lay out the history of Victor Benassi for us.
Great. Thanks, Chris. My first foray into teaching and learning was in graduate school. In fact, it was my first graduate teaching assignment. I was a TA for a faculty member, Robert Lanson, who taught a course in behavior modification. And in this article, or in this course, he assigned an article which was called Goodbye Teacher by Fred Keller of
which I believe we read when I was in grad school as well.
We did,
yes,
indeed.
Yes.
And it was the very first article that I read related to teaching and learning as a graduate student, and I was hooked. So my PhD was in the experimental analysis of behaviorism, Skinnerian, Pavlovian learning and conditioning, but I also had an interest in behavior modification. But as far as practical exposure to teaching and learning, it was being as a graduate assistant, but also as a teacher, where I taught a course in introductory psychology in graduate school, much like you did, of course. My first job after graduate school was at Cal State University at Long Beach, and I was hired to oversee and coordinate this new initiative they had, which was for the introductory psychology course, they were going to use Fred Keller's personalized system of instruction. And in those days, knowing a little bit was that you knew more than virtually everybody else about these issues. And so I was able to secure that position and it was in that role for a number of years at Long Beach.
Yeah. I just want to, I remember you talking about this, and one interesting thing I'd just like to point out is your grad school experience was interesting, and I remember you talking about this when we were there. You had a shorter grad school experience than a lot of other people. Can you just elaborate on that, please? Because I think that's actually really interesting, because I think it does feed into a little bit about how your career identity laid out.
Yeah, it's not, I'm hesitating.
Yes,
a lot of people say, I love New York. I wasn't one of them. Mm-hmm. And so I actually spent 2 years at CUNY. And then I finished my dissertation work actually when I was out at Cal State, Long Beach.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think that does shape what happens your first couple of years out of grad school when you have this different kind of experience and you were working on your dissertation. So I think that is interesting. And then you were put in charge of this project. So I think it must have been an incredibly busy time to try to navigate all that.
Exactly. Yeah. So when I was in charge of this PSI program at Long Beach, as you know, you have if it's a big course, you have an army of tutors or peer tutors. I'm not sure what we called them in those days, maybe mentors, something like that. And we met once a week in an academic course called the Psychology of Teaching. And I taught that course and tried to pull together resources for it. And as you well know, there wasn't a lot around. There was a lot of advice, like there is now, a lot of advice, but not much in the way of scholarly work. But I did develop this. And then in the early 1980s, there was an opening here at the University of New Hampshire for a position to be a faculty member in the psychology department, to do all the normal things that faculty members do related to their research area and teaching courses, but also, and this was unique in those days, is that UNH had developed in the late 60s a PhD program that focused on preparing PhD students in psychology for faculty positions explicitly, and that in addition to the usual research training and experience, which, as you well know, you had a lot of, is that students in the program took a year-long seminar and practicum in the teaching of psychology, and that in the first 2 years they did a teaching assistantship position, and then in their fourth year, after they did this year-long practicum, they began to teach a lower division course in their content area, in your case, some version of cognition, language, perception, and thought, something like that, maybe, in those days.
Cognition, language, and thought was the name of the course.
Right, cognition, language, and thought. And so the whole experience of 4 years was coordinated around learning your academic discipline, your research expertise, and this teaching practicum. So I applied for that job, and there were several people who were interviewed. We were probably the only 3 people that knew anything in a formal way about teaching and learning. And so anyway, I secured that position, and then came to UNH and developed over, a 20 or 30 year period, this seminar and practicum in the teaching of psychology. And there are lots of permutations that have come out of that, which I can comment on.
So what year was that?
I came to UNH in August of 1982.
82. So I got here in 1990. So that program had been running for years prior to that, but you came in and made some changes. And I remember the interesting thing when I was applying for grad school, it was such a draw to see that piece. And I like to tell people that I read Defink before Defink was actually Defink, because you had us read it. And I read McKeechee a long time ago as well. And I think that really did set up a knowledge base that I walked away from that practicum and the seminar with a deeper understanding. Not to undersell the fact that, and I'm going to put Victor on the spot, and he probably doesn't remember this because he's had so many experiences, but he had to observe us teach when we were graduate students. And Victor, I don't know how much you remember about that, but it was a pretty painful experience and scary as hell. But I will say, and I don't know if I've ever shared this with you, but I still have the video of me teaching from October of 1992 that I can share with you. And I can just say that I had spectacular hair and an astounding mustache at the time that I no longer have. But it was a great experience to go through that because it was really learning about teaching from the material we read and then applying it in contexts simultaneously. So we'd go to the seminar and talk about it and go into class and teach. And it was a really, really terrific experience, but scary. It was really scary to walk into that classroom. And I think that a lot of people walk into the classroom the first time without ever teaching, and they're scared for that reason. I walked in scared because I knew I should be able to do a reasonable job. I also knew that you were going to watch me 3 times. But it was scary because I wanted to do it well. And I think that that's a really interesting piece of it. And as you talk about that program, it seems like there'd be a lot of us in the department who've gone on to do this kind of work because it is so essential to our graduate program. So we can come back to that, but I just thought that was really interesting as you talk about that seminar practicum, the impact that I think it had on many, many of us.
And the impact that it had on me also professionally. I just comment, I wish that I had kept every single syllabus that I created for that seminar and practicum course and done a longitudinal analysis about how the course developed. In particular, as I mentioned early on, there were a lot of best practices and advice and a lot of firm conclusions about what promotes teaching and learning based on little or no data.
Yeah.
But over the decades, as you well know, that has changed dramatically, largely due to the work, not completely, but largely due to the work of psychologists. And I know the syllabus reflects that, and I have them on my computer from more recent years. But in the old days, there was something called a typewriter. And that's how you would hand your handwritten syllabus into a person in the department who would type it on the typewriter. And it better be correct the first draft because you get looks if it requires substantial addition, edits, and so on.
Well, I'm young enough to remember the Mimeo machine upstairs that we had where we put it on Ditto Masters. Right. But I will say I have my 92, 93 syllabi for a seminar practicum in teaching. If you have any interest, I can share that with you. I have yours and Peter Fernald's.
Yeah.
So.
Now, you said you came to UNH in 1990?
1990.
1990. So, again, in terms of what maybe drew me ultimately to being involved in a teaching and learning center, in 1992, UNH had received an endowment which was targeted by the president for the creation of a teaching and learning program. It was called the Teaching Excellence Program in those days. And I was involved in creating the position description, the function, and so on. And you surely remember Lee Seidel.
I do.
Who was the first director of the center of the program in those days.
It was over in New England Hall or whatever that was called. New England Center.
New England Center,
That's
exactly.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Right. So my first formal involvement in teaching and learning centers was really in the early 1990s. And I served as the faculty advisor or the advisor to the teaching and learning program advisory committee for all of the years until I moved into academic administration in the provost office. And so right there, that is when I really began to be connected with our teaching and learning center. Somewhere along the way, even before I got involved directly with the Teaching and Learning Center, I began to get a feeling for developing a scholarly research interest in teaching and learning. As you know, my work focuses on judgment of control, contingency learning, the psychology of belief, things like that.
Yes, I remember programming relay racks as your graduate associate, my first year of graduate school.
There you go. Yeah,
moving wires around, trying
right.
to get lights to flash at the right.
That comes from my days in graduate school in New York. But instead of pigeons and rats, it was college students pushing buttons and watching lights.
That's right. That's right.
There you go. So I developed this interest, and one of the areas that I became interested in initially was something called the testing effect. And even though the testing effect was first experimentally studied back in like 1903, 1904, is that largely due to a major scholarly paper by Roediger and Karpicki on the power of testing. So anyway, I got really jazzed about the testing effect and retrieval practice and developed that as a teaching and learning interest. So back in the 2006, 2007 area, the then director of the center, Lee Seidel, decided not to retire from the university, but he had been the director from the beginning, and he wanted to move out of that role. I had already been in an administrative position in the provost office, went back to the psychology department, and I yearned for administration again.
Oh.
I yearned for administration again. And so I applied for and received the position of director of the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. Started in January of 2007 and left that position in May of 2018 when I became a professor emeritus at UNH. I'm still involved in the Teaching and Learning Center through a grant that I'm the co-PI on what we call the Student Cognition Toolbox. But my day-to-day involvement in the center and the university is finished.
Now, can I just ask, because we're going to move into the next sort of topic in a minute, but I want to, so when you moved into the center, did you maintain affiliation with the psychology department? I mean, I know you kept your title professor of psychology and probably tenure, so that if you decided to return, you could. But did you continue to teach at all? Did you have any part in the day-to-day operations of the department?
Because the nature of that, it was called a faculty director position in those days. The faculty director position, it was essentially a 2/3 time position, or what I like to refer to as the 2/3 time allocation, the full-time behavior. So I continue to teach, I think, usually one course, an academic term. I served on committees in the department and in the university. In fact, many of the committees, in terms of advice about what it's like to be a director or involved in a teaching and learning center, is that there's a lot more than working directly and only on teaching and learning. And a lot of that includes involvement in college and university-wide committees. And I did that. And then I continued to have PhD student advisees that did research.
That's right. So Kathy Overson.
Catherine Overson, Mike Melville.
Oh, Mike Melville, that's right.
And others who have gone on to teaching and learning positions themselves.
And what course did you teach when you were teaching?
Well, in those days, it would have been probably... once I became director, I no longer did the seminar and practicum. That other people moved into that role.
Which must have been a tough course to give up.
Yeah.
You seem to really like that course.
Yeah, I did. I taught a course on the psychology of belief. I taught a course on a statistics course, a doctoral course on meta-analysis.
I took that course in 93.
For me?
From you. I took that meta-analysis in 93.
I continued to do that. A seminar in psychology of control, that kind of thing.
Okay. And so as you moved into the center, you did technically 2/3, but it was really a full-time job. And how did that impact? And maybe it didn't. And I guess I want to ask this question because this really is a personal response from a lot of different people as I've talked to them. Did it have an impact on the way you perceived on campus by the department, by other faculty? Because oftentimes you move into administrative positions, and you know this because you were a chair, you were in the provost's office. It does change people's perception of who you are and what it is you do. And I'm just curious if this role in particular had any kind of impact on the way you were perceived by your fellow colleagues within and outside the department.
And outside the university.
Outside the university.
As well. So pretty much up until the early 2000s, most of my work in the department centered on preparing future faculty for teaching, and also on my work in psychology of control and that research interest. And because from the day I arrived at campus, I was identified within my department as somebody that was coordinating this focus of our doctoral program. My identity, right even from the beginning, was clearly there. You may know, I'm sure you do know, that soon after we started the Teaching Excellence program, Lee Seidel and I applied for and got a U.S. Department Education grant to develop a master's in college teaching.
Yep.
And a cognate in college teaching, which was based on the state of research at that time, which of course has grown. So I already had this identity within the department, somebody that knew something about this.
Yeah.
And so when we went to the college and university level, we had a great deal of success. And it was not anything that was particularly perceived as weird or strange. In fact, it maybe even made sense to people. Oh, this is a psychologist. They're supposed to know something about cognition and teaching and learning, and even the social aspects of teaching and learning. So that was a smooth transition for me.
Yeah, and that Master's of Science and Cognate, I won't say as bitterly as I feel, but you started a year after I was eligible for it. So I did not qualify to be a part of that program, but the group below me did. So,
okay. Right.
It's fine. It's fine, Victor.
I went to the
it's
mat
fine.
for you, Chris. And,
You didn't.
I even offered to resign.
Yeah,
and then I thought about it for a while and said, I'm not
I would have thought more of you, Victor, but I'll let it go.
Okay. All right.
But no, so that's interesting. So that you and that speaks to this whole notion of a personal identity, because I do think that because you already had a lot of sort of irons in the fire on campus with regard to teaching and learning, both within the department and across the university, people just did see this as a natural outgrowth. And I think that's fantastic. And you were able, I think, and I don't want to speak for you, but this seems to make sense, that you were able to define the teaching center in a way that made sense to you, and people thought this is what teaching centers are. But as you know, and we'll talk about this when we get to advice, the teaching center at UNH is different than a lot of other teaching centers around the country. They do different things. And I think that when you mentioned before it didn't seem weird, there are places where a teaching center comes in and people do perceive it as weird or it is encroaching on their academic freedom. And so I think that the way that you were able to move into this position was really advantageous for you and what you had already been doing.
Right. I agree. And our program, I mean, it may be less different now.
Much less different now than it was
than it was then. But from the beginning, we did have a sort of a very explicit focus on student learning, promoting student success. Okay, what do you need to know to be able to do that? And so we, right from the beginning, began to glean what we could from research literature that could be applied, but also did our own research. And so one of the emphases of the center then, and even more so now, is that we have a science of learning focus. And we do research with faculty here at UNH within their courses that we're trying to answer questions about what kinds of interventions are going to be most successful in promoting the student learning outcomes that who wants, that the teacher wants, who wants, the department curriculum committee wants, and so on. So we don't define the agenda. What we do is say, if you want to achieve this, here's what we know, or maybe we don't know yet, but here's work that we can do together. All the involvement in the center, sure same as you, is voluntary on the part of, and by the way, we work with faculty, but we, of all categories of faculty, clinical faculty, tenure track faculty, lecturers, research faculty, but we also work with graduate students related to teaching and learning. But there are lots of offices on campus that are interested in the resources and expertise of the center, like the general education program, like the undergraduate research program. There are always committees in the faculty senate. Like I like the joke is that every 3 years we're working again to come up with a new method for student evaluations of teaching. So I've served on more committees on that topic. I mean, if you look at my Vita, it's like a string. Like, he just kept typing the same thing over. No, everyone was different.
I just co-chaired that committee.
They were all different, but they were all the same. And so, and because I knew, as you well know, even in our seminar and practicum, and back in the 80s, and not to mention the 90s, there was a lot of research on issues about reliability and validity of student evaluation of teaching.
I mean, I think we read segments of John Centro when we were in the seminar practicum.
You did.
And what's interesting, you told us, I don't know if you remember this, you told us this. You said your teaching evaluations, there's going to be less variability than you would imagine across the course of it. I don't know if you remember saying that, but I still have, and this is a little embarrassing, but I have every teaching evaluation I've ever earned, including the first semester, my first time teaching. And I have gotten right on that question, overall, how do you rate this instructor? I have almost the exact same number every semester for the last 29 years.
Right.
And it's stunning to me. Different institutions, different level of courses. It's always about the same number with a very small standard deviation. And so, I do think that's interesting, and we did read about that. I will say what you said, though, about your center being drawn into that. I think that's really interesting because that's now the center here at UNH. I'm going to ask you a little bit about the structure, but you're bigger than my center, obviously. But I get drawn into the exact same conversations. I just co-chaired the committee to revise our student evaluation system. We went with a new system because we were using the CERT 2s, which was an ETS product, and they've stopped it. So we went to a new vendor, and we were allowed to develop our own questions. And that was a faculty administrative committee that took almost a year to develop those questions that we finally now have in the system, and we're doing a little bit of a small pilot this summer to make sure they work. We're varying the order of the questions, see if it has any impact, which I don't think it will. But I think in 5 years we're going to be doing it again because there's always controversy over that, and that's what centers end up getting drawn into.
Exactly, and a lot of that can be very valuable depending on how it's dealt with and addressed, but anyway.
Yeah. Well, how's your center structured?
Structured. There is there's a director.
Who's a faculty director?
Well, it was when I was.
Yeah.
That position is now not. I mean, it's not that if there's an opening, it's not that a faculty member couldn't apply. But it's an administrative position.
Okay.
And there's a director. There is an assessment coordinator. This person is not focused on university-wide assessment related to, in our case in New England, NICHE, what used to be NIASC, but the regional accrediting bodies. But it's focused on assessment in the learning experience for faculty, so in their courses. Or beyond that, sometimes we'll work with a department that has curricular learning goals. And that we work with them to address the question. Like we're working right now with a department in the Health Sciences College where they have been experiencing academic challenges, we'll say, on the part of their students early in the program, and that they're engaging in very ineffective and inefficient study strategies. Surprise, surprise. Yeah. So as you know, we've been developing over the last 4 or 5 years an online instructional program that we call the Student Cognition Toolbox that, by the way, is available now on the Carnegie Mellon University Open Learning Initiative website. Yeah,
and we can actually put a link to that into the notes for this.
And so that there's an example of where now, starting in their first year, because the department has cohorts of students that move through the same curriculum, is each year they will complete the Student Cognition Toolbox with a different focus based on the learning goals, which of course become higher, more high level as they go through the program. So there's so we have an assessment coordinator. We also have a science of learning coordinator whose focus is to work with faculty, graduate students, and staff on real learning issues in courses and curricula, and to work through the whole center and the faculty and or department to come up with research questions that are going to help them identify what kinds of interventions are going to be most successful. I mean, this is in the science of learning, as you know, a lot of the early work was well-controlled, outstanding laboratory research. So when you move to the real world, there's more noise. And by the way, noise sometimes means noise in the dorm rooms, I mean, literal, not just statistical noise, and so on. And we also know that students with lower proficiency or expertise in an area are different in many ways than students with higher expertise, and the same intervention does not work necessarily. In fact, what we've found is that many of our interventions work best for low-skill students. High-skill students have sort of figured it out on their own. So that's the kind of work. We also have a graduate student who we've had somebody in that position from the first year the program started. And then we have, because we have a grant, we've had a grant for the last forever. I think there's always been one or more grants, is that we'll have one or more people hired on the grant that work on specifically on that issue. That's the focus of the grant.
So you have 5 or 6 people who work in the center.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's...
And let me just say now, this is different than before. The learning and instructional development group that was in academic technology.
Do they report part of the center?
They now have been moved to the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, and the manager of that group reports to the director of CETL.
Yeah, that's very much, that's what happened with my center last year. I inherited the instructional design team,
right,
and the manager of the instructional design team reports to me.
It's exactly the
exact same model.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting. So as you think about it and talk about these activities, what is absent, and this is what a lot of centers make their bread and butter on, are those big workshops, the one-offs. And I think it's interesting that your center has chosen not to do a lot of those the way that other centers do. I was speaking to a director at a different center who said that if they didn't have one workshop a month, they felt like they weren't fulfilling the need of the faculty. And I'll just say I've been more in line with the model of UNH, where I run some workshops, but I do a lot more work on a one-on-one basis with departments or with faculty to try to help them identify.
The center does workshops, and they often focus on an integrated theme, for example.
Yeah.
So there might be a series of 3 that have activities, and the goal of each of those doesn't happen for all the people involved, but the goal of those is that at the end there's going to be something that they can do, the faculty, graduate students, staff can do, that they can then work with us in a more intensive kind of way.
Yeah.
So we have a number of these thematic workshops. We also bring in expertise from outside the department. I mean, we have people that are not formally involved in the center that also contribute. But you're right. I mean, we do have a focus because of the science of learning focus. We do have a focus on working in an intensive way. I mean, obviously, our group is not that big. I keep saying our group is the group. I'm no longer formally involved in the group, but once the director of the center, always the director of the center.
That's right.
Okay. So the one thing I want to just mention, because this is related to the Society for the Teaching of Psychology, STP, about the identity issue, is that as I developed in my role in psychology, the seminar and practicum, and then I began to become more involved at the college and university level, is that I became more involved with STP. So I forget the exact years that it was, but there was a period of about 5 years or 6 years that UNH was the home of the Graduate Student Teaching Association. And I was the advisor, the mentor, I forget the name of the position. But that's when I first became formally involved with STP in a more intensive way. I'd been a member and active in a number of ways, did some things for teaching of psychology, but with that role, I became more involved, and then sort of concurrent with that, I became more involved also with American Psychological Association Education Directorate, and as you might remember, under the leadership of Paul Nelson, was the development of the Preparing Future Faculty program. And UNH, because we were the preparing future faculty PhD program in psychology at that time, is that I became very involved with APA in the development of that program. The other day I just went on their website. Some of the stuff from back in the day is still on there. And I actually don't know so much about what they're actively doing there. But let me just say, one of the things that we did with APA and the Ed Directorate, we developed a course which was a one semester, in effect, version of the year-long seminar and practicum in psychology. At UNH, we called it the Preparing to Teach a Psychology course. And we offered that course to students from literally across the United States, and not literally around the world, but I'm looking here at Chile, England, France, Russia, Mexico, Portugal, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and others, where we had mostly doctoral students from those programs that were taking that course, and that was through the APA initiative. And then finally, and this is when I went in over my head on being involved with STP, for better or worse, for me and for the society, I was elected president of STP, and I served as president in 2013. And I must say that was some of the best professional experience. But I believe that I was perceived, you mentioned about identity, by that time was that I was an experimental psychologist, but who had a deep and rich interest in teaching and learning.
Yeah, it's interesting as you bring up that whole history, because I have a couple of comments. One is when you were the president, or when you were the advisor of the Graduate Student Association, Bethany Fleck was, I think at one point, the president.
She was indeed.
Bethany was actually sitting in the same spot that you and I are currently at her desk, and Bethany was my former student as an undergraduate.
Absolutely.
And I know Bethany has a deep interest in teaching and learning, and so I think you had that profound impact on her and her career and several of her cohorts. But the other piece that I think is really interesting about the connection that I have to this is that Preparing Future Faculty program has moved out of psychology. I mean, it's still within psychology, of course, but to other disciplines. We have a Preparing Future Faculty program on our campus in our Sport and Exercise Physiology doctoral program, and I lecture in that course every semester to the students about the experiences that I had at UNH and how I can help them make those connections for what they want to do. So it really did have a profound impact, not just within psychology, but beyond that, as more and more disciplines are beginning to look at preparing graduate students to do the job that most of them are going to end up doing when they get out, so that they're able to handle a class. I have two graduate students who work for me, both of whom have gone through that program as part of their responsibility for working with me, as they go through an individualized version of that, where they teach a course that I talk to them about and look at their materials and guide them through and do some observations, so that they're prepared when they leave the program, when they have their PhD, to go off and teach. So I think that kind of mentorship piece is really important for graduate students. And I think that, we're circling around this issue of identity. I think that it sets the tone for the identity of the graduate students when they get into their career, that they are scholars, because of course they're getting a PhD and they're going to do some scholarly research, but they're also educators, and they need to take that part of their position more seriously than I think some faculty do when they get out and they just see themselves as scholars. So I do think it does have that kind of impact. As you were talking about it too, and you have this rich history both with STP and with psychology, I think what's really interesting, as I said before, is there's a number of people within the discipline who have gone on to run teaching centers. And I know you mentioned a couple connections before. I think that if you look at the slate of the graduate students from the University of New Hampshire doctoral program, and I have looked at it, although I don't see a number of them directly working in teaching centers, there's a lot of them who have strong connections with their teaching centers, including I did a review of a center not that long ago, and one of the former graduate students from UNH was deeply involved in the work of the center. So I do think that does have some kind of impact. It's interesting, though, because centers really do vary in terms of how they're perceived on campus, whether they are faculty positions or whether they are administrative positions, and that has an impact on how the other faculty see them. I will make one other point, because I'm going to be talking to people in other podcasts about this. You're not one of these people, but if you come from the outside and come into the institution as a center director, that has a different flavor than if you come from within, because you don't have that history of being a part of the institution. And as you come in, you have to learn some of the values and mores and, frankly, the norms of the institution to be able to function effectively.
Right. I agree.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and it really does. My view is that ultimately it really depends on the person.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go to an institution that has had, a faculty member from this department for 3 years and a faculty member from that department for 2 years, and that this is somebody does that job, and you come in as a professional who is not in a faculty position, maybe what it is an institution where you were an associate director in a professional position, is that surely there could be perceptions and biases and expectations, but ultimately I think it depends on the person.
Yeah.
One thing because I know we're going to be ending up here maybe with some advice thing, I just wanted to mention, I meant to mention it before, is that, let's think about this. We're back in the 1960s, the mid-1960s, maybe even the early 1960s, and Raymond Erickson and Eugene Mills, who were faculty members in the psychology department in UNH, said, we ought to start preparing graduate students for their teaching roles in addition to their research roles. They applied for it and received a grant from the National Science Foundation.
Amazing.
I have
Do you have the grant?
I have that grant proposal.
Wow.
It's on an IBM typewriter. The paper is yellow, and so
you should
on.
probably scan that at some
It
point.
included hiring faculty positions, including John Nevin, who was the chair of the department at Columbia.
Tony?
At that time, Tony Nevin.
Tony Nevin.
For example.
Yeah.
So, and then you think about the early people that were involved in that program, like Roy Erickson, but also my colleague Peter Fernald.
Oh, yes.
For many decades, he and I sort of coordinated one semester or the other semester. So I just wanted to give a shout out to those folks.
Yeah, and of course I mentioned Peter before. I had Peter second semester after I had you for the seminar, and it was a different take. It was a different focus, but equally valuable. And Peter's advice and Peter's comments after observing my class were very encouraging and very supportive, and Peter was a wonderful person who provided a lot of support. A very different group of readings too. I have his syllabus and his work, and I think Peter, you two complemented each other very well in that seminar. So as we sort of come to an end, I just wanted to know if you had any advice for people who want to work in this field, who might want to move from faculty position. You mentioned before, a little tongue-in-cheek about the drive to return to administration, but there are people who see this as a way into administration. There was an article written, I think a year ago now, that came out in Inside Higher Ed about how a director of a center for teaching and learning ought to be considered highly for your position of provost, because they have a lot of different ways of viewing things. So people do see this now as a way into administration. And I'm curious if you have advice or thoughts on what things people ought to do, how they ought to position themselves, or advice on whether or not they ought to do it.
Yeah. So depending on where you are in your career and what your expertise is, more formally or even informally related to the role and missions of teaching and learning centers, in particular one on your campus, is that it might be a good idea to try to get involved initially in a sort of faculty fellow kind of role. Most teaching and learning centers, particularly at larger institutions, but even in fact, some smaller institutions, it's faculty fellows that run the show. But it's, in other words, to get involved, to see from the inside what the work is of the center. I mean, as we know, it is a really broad set of experiences which require a broad set of skills. The more of those you have, the more you're going to be able to make connections out beyond the center. So it is a certain kind of role. I mean, if somebody really doesn't like to do administrative work, then you don't want to be involved in a teaching and learning center, even though you might like I like the idea of working with faculty to help improve, which is great. And in fact, I would call it necessary but not sufficient kind of experience and perspective. So I think that to get involved at some level initially to see if this is really what floats your boat, so to speak, I think would be a valuable kind of thing. Another thing I think would be valuable for a faculty member to consider is, what skills and expertise do I have that would be of value to the Teaching and Learning Center at my institution, or if I want to apply for positions beyond. It's unlikely that somebody who has no experience with a center is going to be able to leave their psychology department at, say, the University of New Hampshire and apply for a director or an associate director position at pick your favorite university outside, because you look at the job description, and for those administrative positions, it's going to say 3 to 5 years worth of experience, 5 to 7 worth of progressively responsible experience, and so on.
Budgetary oversight. That's the big one, the budgetary
and
oversight.
Of course, that's what I mean in terms of, because the skill set is not like just, I know a lot about psychology, I know a lot about cognition, I'm perfect for this job. But my view is those are really critical skills. I want more directors to have a knowledge base in that area. But there are these other things like managing people, like the budget, dealing with an extremely diverse set of people and so on. So you start off smallish in your own institution if you can, and then move on. Now, I mean, a number of the people that I know about and that you know about who have gone into administrative position in centers, at least initially, started at their own institution. So that what I'm suggesting, I think, is the common path. That's really, I don't know if it might be unique. I don't know of anybody that went from zero to being a director of a center. Maybe they moved to a college or university where they had a role and then moved into something.
Yeah. I think you're right, and I think it is interesting. You gain the experience, and the administrative piece, I think you can't undersell how important that is. The managing people and the ability to understand your role on campus as someone who is an advocate for faculty and student learning, yet you walk the line. So as an administrator, I have administrative responsibilities, but as an administrator, I also recognize I'm not going to be effective with faculty if faculty think I'm going to run to their dean if they come to me with some kind of pedagogical issue. So I have to be incredibly aware of those issues on campus. And then, of course, the budget thing and the managing people thing are things that you just learn over time as you do it, that may not be your the center of your skill set, but you can manage it, and then you can apply your skills in other places that you really feel valued. But I think that as centers grow and you have more than one person, you can really diversify, which I think your center has done really well. You have a SOTL person, you have a graduate student who runs projects, and I think that kind of model is one that's really going to become, I believe, more dominant even at small schools where they'll have a center director and maybe a couple of faculty fellows who run programs, because it becomes a lot very quickly, especially if you're effective. And that's, I think, a problem that UNH has had, and I say problem in quotes, is that as effective as you become, the demand becomes higher, and that taxes your human resources. But I think the advice is good. I mean, you need to get involved and see what it's like, and talk to people on your campus, and find out that your passion for teaching might not be all you need to do to go into this field. So, any final thoughts you'd like to say about your career in this field, your experiences, things that you've really liked, things you miss now that you're? I mean, you say you're retired, Victor, but you got a grant after you retired, which I think is not fair. You're running this grant, and I can only guess that your Davis grant's up next year, and you might be considering another one. What advice do you have for people? I know you love this.
My role has gone down. I'm a co-PI now.
Oh, you're just a co-PI now. Okay.
Yes, and so the position in psychology department that I had, I mean, always will have a special place for me professionally. At the same time, being the director of the Teaching and Learning Center here at UNH for 11 years or so is pretty much at the top of my list of professional experiences.
Yeah.
Because what it did was it allowed me to take, you say, this passion that you had, but also to put it into practice in practical ways, but also to get more involved externally beyond the university. It has been something, I mean, I've met and gotten to know quite well a lot of amazing people within STP, but also beyond STP that just wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Yeah.
Because as you know, I'm a shy person at heart.
I do know that. I do, and I actually appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today. I will put out one plug, and that is for the book, the 2014 book that you edited, along with myself and Catherine Overson, and there's a new version of that book that'll be coming out in 2022, I would imagine, which is a lot longer than the first book with more chapters. And so that work is being shared with others. And we'll put a link to the 2014 book in the notes for people who want to look at it. It's a book on science of learning, and it has a lot of the people who have done science of learning work in a variety of ways. And then the new book will be put out by STP again in 2022. But Victor, thanks for everything you've done in your career to help teaching and learning, to help these centers run. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you taking the time on this summer day. I will say this was done in person, which was really nice, because coming out of pandemic, it's nice to actually see people face to face. But thanks, Victor, and take care, and hopefully we get a chance to see each other again soon.
Thanks, Chris.